I'm going to sort of introduce this. It's a 3-line sort of presentation, and all I'm going to do is set the sort of scene. Justine will then come in and talk a little bit more about sustainable development goals and start to link it to the construction industry, and then Lloyd's going to come along and pose a few questions for us to sort of discuss as we see fit. So the way that I'm going to set the scene is just to sort of really let us think about why we are sitting here, really, in this sort of thing, and then go forward. The reason being is that I'm a professor of environmental toxicology and aquatic toxicology, so it's a bit alien to me, some of this. This is why it's a broad brush introduction. So, why? Well, we all know that over the last few years we've certainly globally reduced poverty, and these Sustainable Development Goals that have been set by the UN has done a fantastic job in doing that around the world. But we also know at this stage, and this is from this morning, that as poverty decreases, we have this huge increase in populations around the globe, and this puts huge strain on our environment. It puts huge strain on the distribution of slums and in urban areas, specifically in the developing countries. We see that, and I think this is a picture of Mumbai. So the issues are centred around Southeast Asian cities, where you have slums in the bluey bits. I think this is from Google Maps or whatever, and more advanced sort of cities thereafter. And that sort of coincided with that huge population growth. And what sort of stresses and strains does that put on our society? Well, for my interest, and the last couple of days I was at a meeting on water resources, and water resources in this area is a huge issue. You probably don't realise, but our water scarcity is on par with southern Spain, and that is because of the number of people that live here. It's not about how much it rains, it's because of where our resources come and what they do. Water resources are hugely problematic around this area, and for my interest it's toxicants. Resilience in water also means resilience in having clean water. Energy as well, we've had a lot about that, and that's one of the focuses today. The health that comes with the population growth and the issues that we have with living in built environments. We've had a number of sessions on how we can alleviate, how we can help our well-being within specially designed, well-built buildings. Climate change always comes there, and one of my interests is biodiversity loss. And any of us that lecture on this type of stuff know this graph, and it's from 1798, Malthus, and it's their basic theory. At some point, the population growth, our resources become limited. And we could probably say that we are at that, or have actually gone past this. Many of you will know Rockstrom's papers came out in 2009 before the IPCC conference there has been updated then. But they set out in Stockholm Institute, I can't remember what it is, Institute of Sustainability or whatever, they set out this safe operating space for humanity. And the ways and the wedges in red is at that time in 2009 where they were saying that we have exceeded the safe operating space for humanity, for us to live on the world. Quite a profound statement. So in this instant, genetic biodiversity loss. At that point we had exceeded in 2009. Now you have all seen, I'll show you an image in a second, I'll go on to the next picture, decline in flying insects. 2009, this warning there was in 2015. So from 2009 to now it has escalated, that biodiversity loss. The other issues that we have is within nitrogen and phosphorus biogeochemical flows. They've already exceeded. Probably most of you know we're going into a phosphorus crisis. I think we'll peak in 2030. Phosphorus is vital for how we keep our populations going, how we feed ourselves. As soon as that runs out, there's no more. We can't feed ourselves. So it's something very, very fundamental that we have to do. I'm saying this in the context of this conference because there's bigger pictures that I hope you're all aware of, but keep this in your mind with what your work and where you're going forward. The thing I'm interested in is that novel entities. They changed it. It was called chemical entities at that time. We have no idea about the novel chemicals in our environment, or whether we have exceeded our carrying capacity for humanity or not. That's what my research is about, or partially about. From a human perspective, you're probably aware that each one of us probably has 400 synthetic chemicals swimming around, man-made chemicals in our blood systems. Animals have the same. Whether that's doing anything, I don't know. So when you are designing, constructing built environments, keep that in mind. Construction, chemicals, what we are doing, it's all of one big picture. And that's what I say there. So that's the bigger picture that I'm putting out there. Just to remind you of the state of affairs. Don't want to be too depressing, but it is a little bit depressing, to be perfectly honest. And one of the worrying things that we have is why we don't change our attitude and don't change is this concept of shifting baselines. This is from a fisheries perspective, Daniel Pawley from UBC in Canada. Shifting baseline syndrome, what that actually means is that each generation they're shifting the baseline of their knowledge. I, as a young person in the 70s, you've heard all this phrase before, can remember my windscreen being splattered with insects as we drove around the Suffolk countryside. I do it this time, there's nothing splattered. So my kids, their baseline is nothing splattered. My baseline is massively splattered. So that's what they mean by shifting baseline. It happens in the oceans, it happens on land. My interest is freshwater biology. The biggest biodiversity loss as a biome is in fresh waters. We just don't see it, we just do not recognise it. My big thing that I have to try to do is talk about convincing, changing people's attitudes, changing that. I like little critters in rivers, but you try and explain to the public that a little critter in a river is important. Yeah, if you can't explain climate change and make that important, you can't do. My little critters, they've gone. They're just not there. So that's my bigger picture. And I'll give it over to Justine to start to go down into the SDGs. And then actually Lloyd will make it more relevant.
Okay, so I know we've talked a lot about population, but that's because it's perhaps one of the most important aspects of why we're at where we're at now globally. So over 200 years we've gone from 1 billion to 7.6 billion. That figure is probably an underestimate because that is only the figures of people who have been registered, births that have been registered globally. And there are probably a lot of unregistered births that doesn't take account for. And that includes the number of people who die every month or every day. So that's a global increase. So if you look at 7 million a month, when you look at the figures as of July, so from July 2019, there were 7 million people added to the planet every single month, which is just slightly over the population of the whole of the east of England. So that kind of puts into perspective that this many people every month are coming onto the planet and they all need feeding and they all need resources and they all need energy and they all would like access to technology and all the things that come with a 21st century lifestyle. A lot of the data is being driven by science, and if you go back to the 1980s, because none of this is new, this is the shocking thing. I mean, I've been doing this for nearly 30 years, and we're still having similar conversations to the ones that we had 30 years ago. Only I would say that in the last 5, there was a big environmental movement in the 80s that came off the back of the 70s, obviously for the first time, 1969. What happened in 1969? apart from our birthday years.
We landed on the moon.
Yeah, we landed on the moon. So for the first time in the history of man, we were actually seeing images of the Earth. And that was quite profound, and in many ways began the beginnings of the environmental movement. This idea that we really are, this is it, this is the one planet. Obviously lots of other things going on, like the Vietnamese War, use of napalm, all these kind of things. We were starting to get a scientific understanding of chemicals and what implications they had for the planet, and that once they're in the environment, they're persistent, mutagenic, carcinogenic. And that was really where things first started from a scientific term. But I can remember seeing the front cover of the New Scientist talking about CFCs and the hole in the ozone layer back in the 1976 edition. And here we are, still having these conversations and still trying to grapple it. So the scientific community have known for a very long time, perhaps not to the degree, the sorts of things that would be a challenge moving forward, but other people haven't really got behind it to move it on. But we're now in a space where, so this is from Davos, which takes place every year. So this was Davos last year, which basically is a meeting of World Economic Forum leaders and other business leaders, all of whom working with the third sector, starting to acknowledge, or moving beyond just acknowledging, some of the issues and the disruptors that we're confronted with. And you can see a lot of those resonate with the SDGs. So now we're seeing a push from big business. And it's not all philanthropic. A lot of this is, you know, if you're going to have a thriving business, you've got to have people to sell things to, right? So if you bring everybody up, then they have more money, then they can buy your goods. It's no good if we're reaching a tipping point economically as well as environmentally. Or I could just be gazing. So what sort of disruptors are we looking at when we're thinking about the SDGs and what's driving the agenda? So clearly population growth, planetary boundaries, and that's in every sphere. So Nick said about the insects, we all kind of understand climate change, air quality, water quality, consumption, natural resources is perhaps one of the biggest issues. Technology. It's all very well that we have all this technology, and technology is great, and it can do amazing things. But technology needs conflict minerals, certain types of minerals that also have a limited level of abundance to be able to be used within the equipment that we think is going to make everything all right. There will come a point where those resources aren't available anymore. And then what do we do? Socio-political doctrines, and I think a lot of that is possibly linked to technology as well. The world is a very interesting place at the moment. Access to technology means that we can all see on social media, everybody's opinion can be heard. If something happens on the other side of the world, we know about it that minute. 5 minutes later, everybody's having a discussion about it. That's never happened ever to the human race, that we've got this flow of information and exchanges of ideas. And those exchanges of ideas change us socially, and they therefore change us politically, and they inform the activism and the pressure groups. I mean, we saw today from Richard, the day they went in to vote on the climate change declaration for the 2030, the climate strike children were all outside on the steps of the council offices as each of the politicians was going in before they were about to deal with it on the agenda. So there you can see pressure group having a very real action at a local level. Public awareness, government legislation and policy, obviously that's a key driver. EU legislation has been fantastic for the environmental and the social well-being of the UK. We hopefully will retain all of the elements of that legislation, but we can't be sure as we exit whether or not we will. Any time will tell. NGOs and charities. I don't know if we've still got lecturers in from sociology and healthcare. We had quite a few that were coming. So we're seeing charity groups moving into spaces now that were traditionally taken up by government roles because we don't have the funding or the money left to support central government or local government activities. Businesses as well, obviously academia and research. And then future markets, in terms of economy, also this idea that perhaps, I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept that GDP isn't the only way you can measure a country's well-being or a country's success. So starting to, certainly in the UK, move more into looking at well-being and social sustainability. So the goals themselves, there are 17. Within each of those, there are 169 targets, and sitting under all of those targets are a raft of indicators. Some of them are quite simplistic, and they require data to be submitted by each of the nations. Every single country subscribed to these. So unlike the Millennial Development Goals, which I think there were only 8 of those, which focused very much on the pressing need to alleviate poverty and feed the world, it was realised, going back to that initial 1980s sort of Brundtland, the 1987 Brundtland Our Common Futures report, that if we were really going to tackle these issues, we had to widen the scope because everything's so interconnected. So these new goals then recognise some of these areas, if not indeed all of them. And even that's remarkable in itself, that every single country was able to sit down and agree, yes, all these things are really important to the development of humanity. Sustainable development meaning that, no, you shouldn't develop yourself at the expense of something else. So let's just not focus on economy and say to hell with social well-being and environmental well-being, or let's not focus exclusively on the environment and not worry about the strong economy. So it's the idea of lifting everything simultaneously. So Kumu software, so systems mapping can be a very useful way of seeing how everything interrelates. I like this one because it's kind of showing where each of the SDGs touches in terms of targets on other SDGs. So where you can see the number, so the number 9 there shows that there are 9 points of contact between those particular SDGs. And the ones that came out as being the most influential were responsible consumption and production. So the implication being that we can redress or address our consumption and production, then we will have quite a profound impact on all the other SDGs. And that's the importance of the SDGs. It's easy to think, right, okay, I'm doing something around climate, therefore I'll focus on climate, or I'm looking at the sea, so I'm going to focus on number 14. So in that case, you then miss out the opportunity to actually tackle the SDGs in the way that they're supposed to be. So you should be looking at all of the SDGs within any given area and not being siloed, which was kind of where we were going wrong before. So we've just reported in. So 2015 they came out, and to be fair, UK government hadn't done an awful lot in this space. So the first reporting period was July of this year. Every single country had to report in to the UN saying what they were doing and how they were performing against each of the SDGs. Initially, what we'd done is we'd put responsibility into the Department for Foreign International Affairs. And then about 7 months before we were due to report in, suddenly the penny dropped, and then all of the SPDs were then given to the departments where they were deemed most appropriate. So, health and well-being type things sit with those government departments. Innovation, they sit within those government departments. The measuring up, which was a massive stakeholder piece, we work with the UK Stakeholders for Sustainable Development Organisation, the Institute, which is made up of business communities, as well as universities and government organisations. But we have only reported in terms of policy. So not what's actually happening amongst the ground, amongst the public, but what policy procedures are in place to meet the requirements of the SDGs. And this is how we did. So with 57% inadequate on all of the SDGs, 15% poor, We scored very badly in biodiversity, life on land and below the sea. 24% good, no surprises, that was mostly in innovation and energy. Anything that has an economic value or an attribute that is going to enhance our economic growth, that's where we did well. In the social, softer stuff, that's where we didn't perform quite as well. Or in some cases, forget the social stuff, when it came to nature, hardly anything at all, which is surprising because any of you who spent any time in the UK, we love our nature. We love nature programmes. You know, Attenborough is a god. We watch Countryfile. We love to go see it. Most of our land is owned by the people, the National Trust, the Wildlife Trust. Who's got membership? Who lives in the UK of one of those organisations? Yeah, I mean, but that's what we do at the weekend. We like nothing better than going out into nature. And so therefore it's very curious that when we're building our habitations and we're building our cities, we're not looking to integrate it into our environment, that the environment is somehow over there. It's somewhere we go to rather than being somewhere in which we exist. And we are, at the end of the day, a species just like any other. That's some very interesting research done around well-being in green spaces. Green prescribing now with the NHS for people who have mental health issues. So you actually get something written down on a chip saying, right, you can go and do some walks. Lovely if you think about it. I'm sorry, I can't come into work today. I've got to go and do my healthy constitutional walk that my GP has recommended for me to go and do. What a great idea. A lot of research showing that it does have a massive impact on people's well-being. So conversely, if you live in a part of a city or an urbanised area where you have no access to that, then it's going to have a very negative impact on your well-being. I mean, we have people coming to Suffolk who are scared to sleep, in a cottage or in the countryside because it's so quiet, or nature is something that they've not really experienced or been able to experience. So coming back to consumption and production then, the next data set will be coming out obviously in 2020, so I'll be very interested to see how we've done in the last 10 years given how much shift there's been in the last 2 years. So we can see this is in tonnes for each individual country. And you can see we're, in the last 10 years, despite everything, despite the fact that we are all trying, a lot of countries are trying, to try and reduce our footprint, it's not really having a major impact. And is that surprising when we've got a whole region's worth of population added onto the planet every month? And that's going to be exponential, so that's going to be double that probably in 3 years' time per month. So to try and counteract that, a lot of the SDGs were being dealt with quite rapidly. We've now got the New Urban Agenda to really try and get to grips with SDG 11, which is cities and urban communities. So this is a roadmap, again, lots of great think tanks feeding into this from many, many different nations to set out a criteria of how we need to be approaching building our communities, but also retrofitting, if you like, our communities. And there you can see megacities. I think someone was talking about that this morning, but we're getting to this point where if you imagine 68% of the world's population is going to live in a city, the urban areas, so that's not just energy, obviously that's transport and all the associated things that go around that. So is this where we're all going to end up living? Because this is where the jobs are. And if it is, how are we going to make it a beautiful, wholesome place to be living in? So most of you will be familiar with these in one form or another. So green, pretty early out there. One thing the UK is very good at is legislation and building regs. And once we get behind something, we will produce a piece of legislation. Whether or not that legislation is then enforced or monitored or any of these other things is a whole other story, because again that comes down to resources, enforcing officers being able to go out and have a look. And I'm sure many of you who've worked on with BREEAM, we'll see that quite often things get designed out at the last minute for cost reasons. And what are the things that usually get designed out? Anything that's just nice to have. So, oh, well, we would have liked a little wildlife garden here and some nice soft planting, but actually the cost of our sanitary ware has just gone up, so we're going to have to pop it there. And this is invariably what happens. So BREEAM is a good standard, that is continuously improving, so if any of you get the opportunity, I don't like to kind of recommend other universities, but the UEA Enterprise Centre, absolutely fantastic building, that has no heating at all, and this is England, and is used by basically solar gain, passive solar gain. All the wastewater is used. There's reed beds on the roof, which look beautiful, stunning. Collect all the water, recycle it. Every single thing in that building is made from locally sourced natural materials. It's a fabulous space, and it wasn't horrendously expensive to build. But again, this was money that was been obtained through our LEP, so sort of grant funding. Not everybody has the luxury to be able to build that kind of building. And then obviously the LEEDS. LEEDS is great. LEEDS is great. It is. So the LEEDS certification really has taken over the world in terms of the standards. So if you look at when LEEDS first came out to this year, this is the take-up. So the deep red are where people have gone for the absolute highest rank within the LEEDS standard. And you can see there's quite a lot. Obviously it's American standard, so you can see it there in America, but also picked up in Europe. And where this really helps with the SDGs, and I think can be widened out, is there's a very big social aspect to it. So the consultation phases at the beginning, of those who've used the LEEDS standard or worked on buildings with it, there's the expectation that you are talking to the building users, not just the client, but people who'll be in the building, occupying that space. What's the lighting like for them? How would they like that building to feel? So we're talking about how we feel in a building, not just how much it will cost. And also looking at those tunnelling through costs, which are often passed on to the client. So as a developer, I don't really care if it's going to cost a lot of money for this particular energy system to be put in, or this particular cooling and chilling, because I'm not going to bear that cost. I'm just going to put the cheapest in and try and make the best profit that I can. But for the building user, you're then stuck with something that where your running costs are going to be quite high and maybe not particularly energy efficient for it. By having these sorts of standards, you know that you kind of, some assurances that that's not going to be the case. And also LEEDS is asking us to look at location of transportation, so we're kind of taking into account the social dimensions again. How are people getting there? If we're saying the right to work for everybody, if I don't live in a central business district and I live way over there and I don't have a car and I have to get transport in, how am I going to get to this job in this amazing new building? Perhaps I can't afford to. Am I therefore excluded from working somewhere else? So it's starting to look at those sorts of issues in terms of the design and access statements, which is something that we have here in the UK. Water efficiency, crucial. Do we really need to be flushing the toilet with water that's been cleaned, chlorinated, treated before it goes into a lavatory and then disappears to go through the leaf again? Probably not. Sustainable sites, and what happens to that site afterwards once we're obviously had some great presentations today about kind of end of life of buildings and how that's factored in. I'll try and wrap it up a bit quicker because I don't know how I'm doing on time. So mechanisms to adapt. Education is key. So we saw obviously class of their own today, getting that next generation into a new mindset, who are very receptive to these new ways of working. We don't have to keep doing things the way we always have, because this is the new generation who's going to be looking at sustainability in a way that we probably haven't quite been able to get to grips with. Legislation, again, as I say, in the UK, legislation has a part to play. Strategic environmental assessment, so right from the local authority level or the county level, when we're looking at master planning, having a mind to what buildings should be allowed within that space. and what sort of transport, and where the housing zoning is going to be and the quality of that housing. Environmental impact assessment. So we are seeing a shift in that. So some councils are very good. So where you might not have a requirement during scoping or the pre-planning stage to actually have to carry out a full environmental impact assessment if you don't fall under the scope of the Part B of the legislation, they're still requiring that certain things are going to be done. Health impact assessments, they've been around for about 5 or 6 years now, but we're seeing them being required more and more. What are the ramifications of this particular building or this particular housing development going to have on the health of the people within that area during construction as well as occupancy? Neighbourhood plans, again, that's another thing that we have in the UK, which allows people in the neighbourhood to say what they want to happen within their parish, what they will and won't accept in terms of development. Not a lot of people know that this piece of legislation is in place and therefore haven't done any neighbourhood plans, so there's no recourse later on when planning starts to push onto the edges of their parish and can cause all sorts of issues. Exemplary architects and developers. So we've got one of Foster's buildings just here in Ipswich, if you get a chance to go and have a look at it. Fantastic, I think it was designed in the 80s, an exemplary building of its time. And exemplary developers, so developers looking to put in not just solar panels on social housing because they've been told to by the local authority, but perhaps think about putting solar panels in on as standard on their new builds. Exemplary clients, so as well, us, as a university, I have a responsibility to ask more of the buildings that I want to be put in on campus. We are the clients, and we should be specifying the brief in a particular way and not being afraid of going slightly over with the funding. And all of this hopefully will massage the supply chain and, as I say, the end of life of the building. And we're almost there. I think I can't remember, somebody earlier today was saying, so this was quite an interesting one. So this was a story that ran this year. So here's our lovely, this is in South London. So basically what had happened was, an old site was being redeveloped, so you've got all the private housing here. Here's the lovely play area for all the children who occupy the private housing. What you can't see, but on Google View you can, is the whole thing is gated. The only way you can get into that play area is if you have a key fob and you're able to get in, and only the families and the children of the families who live on this side are allowed to access that because they're the only ones with the key. And then on this side we've got the social housing, and here's their play area. They were called Poor Doors, and fortunately not happening quite so much now after The Guardian picks up and ran with the story. And there again you can see, although that's in Mumbai, and that was very interesting. The new block of flats were put in to try and support moving people into better quality housing rather than unstructured developments. But what happened was people didn't want to go into that housing. They hadn't been consulted. The housing had just been built for them. And the reason why was all of their businesses, they are running in these streets. So by going into a block of flats, they were no longer able to run their business. They couldn't fix the cars or do the things that they were doing where they had lived before. And that's why community consultation is so important in these sorts of areas, that we can't just go and think, we know best, these are the SDGs, you need to have a wonderful house to live in, or a lovely new flat with this thing and that thing. We have to engage with community when we're doing these sorts of things. And here are some lovely things that are being done. So, please apologise if I pronounce this incorrect. The LEEDS Forest City, in the process of being built, that's obviously the desired outcome. And it's just going through its first phases now. And absolutely, who would not want to live there? Just the air quality, which obviously is an issue for China, is going to be much better there, and just visually more pleasing and a pleasanter space to be in. And then New Clark City in the Philippines, a lot of this construction is using some of the volcanic ash and aggregate that they have quite close by. One of their issues is earthquakes. So what they're doing is they're building this new city slightly further away from the fault line, because of all the unusual weather events and conditions that we're experiencing at the moment, with a view to slowly moving everybody from the existing city across to New Clark City to try and keep the people safe. But rather than doing it cheaply, they're doing it in an exemplary fashion. So you can see what you can't see here, but you can see all the solar paneling here, and there are walkways. So there are green bridges, green walkways connecting the city from above street level, so that they're getting people up off. It's like something from a sci-fi movie, Blade Runner, where all the rich people live at the top, and all the clean air, and all the poor people are scrabbling about. Obviously, if that is the sci-fi future that we anticipate, then that's what we're going to end up with. So, I think, yeah, that's pretty much it.
The easiest job. I'm going to pull all that together. I suppose, to wrap this up, I'm going to throw it out to the floor for some discussion. I'm going to throw out some elements that maybe we should reflect on. And I suppose the first one I'm looking at is, and I suppose Nick and Justine have really painted a really good picture of very broad coming into the narrow in terms of what's happening in the world in relation to SDGs. And I suppose the first question I pose is, are we doing enough? Is a conference like this where we're discussing SDGs doing enough? Is it, doing our actions at the local level enough to actually address climate change? Justine mentioned the famous Sir Norman Foster, designed many good buildings. He presented a keynote address at the Rematerializing Sustainability at the Lafarge Wholesome Foundation event that they hold every 4 years. And just last April, it was in Cairo. And he suggested, he gave a keynote on what's happening sustainably and what it is we should be doing and what it is the Norman Foster practice is doing to address that. But he put up one statistic and he was projecting forward, 2050, 10 billion people on the planet, followed by a slide to say that 1 in 3 people will live in slums.